Captain Henrik Larsen's voice cut through the morning briefing like a blade, but it was his cruel laughter that would haunt the room for years to come. As 26-year-old Della Mitchell stood frozen in the Communications Center of NATO Forward Base Aurora, watching her superior mock the tremor in her hands and the shadows under her eyes, no one could have predicted that those very scars he ridiculed would soon save every life on that base. In exactly 72 hours, when enemy forces surrounded them and conventional warfare failed, it would be Della's broken mind that would prove to be the most tactical weapon they had. This is the story of how the woman they called damaged goods became the soldier who rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Base Aurora began at 06:30 sharp on a surprisingly sunny Tuesday in Northern Estonia, but Communications Specialist Della Mitchell had been awake since 0300. She sat in the back row of the briefing room, her notebook positioned to hide the slight tremor in her left hand as she traced patterns on the page, a coping mechanism she developed during her 2 tours in Syria before transferring to this quieter European posting. At first glance, Della appeared to be just another junior enlisted soldier trying to stay invisible during morning briefings. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, her uniform pressed to perfection, and her green eyes focused intently on the tactical displays. But what her colleagues couldn't see was the intricate mental map she was building of every communication network, every potential point of failure, and every backup system that might be needed if their primary infrastructure collapsed. Della possessed an extraordinary gift for understanding communication patterns under extreme stress, a skill born not from textbooks, but from surviving situations where a single missed radio call meant death. During the siege of Aleppo, she had maintained communication for a forward medical unit while artillery shells rained overhead, keeping 17 wounded soldiers alive by routing emergency calls through 7 different backup networks she had improvised from scrapped equipment. But that accomplishment wasn't in her official file, buried as it was beneath medical reports about anxiety disorders and recommended psychological evaluations. Her current assignment at Base Aurora was considered a reward posting, a quiet intelligence-gathering station where NATO monitored Russian military movements across the Baltic. It was the kind of assignment given to soldiers who needed to recover, who had been through too much, who required careful handling. Della knew this, just as she knew that her colleagues saw her as someone who had been broken by war rather than forged by it. The tremor in her hands was a constant reminder of the mortar blast that had killed her unit's commanding officer in Syria. The way she sometimes lost focus during loud noises stemmed from the 3 days she'd spent trapped in a collapsed bunker, maintaining radio contact while buried under concrete and twisted metal. The detailed notes she took during every briefing, the backup plans she sketched for scenarios that would never happen, the way she memorized every frequency and protocol, all of it was dismissed as the obsessive behavior of someone trying too hard to prove she belonged. What her superiors didn't understand was that her meticulous preparation wasn't born from anxiety, but from experience. She had learned that in war, the difference between life and death often came down to the smallest details. Knowing which communication channels stayed clear during electromagnetic interference, understanding how to boost signal strength using unconventional antenna arrays, recognizing the subtle changes in radio chatter that indicated an impending attack. During her off-duty hours, while other soldiers relaxed or socialized, Della studied the base's communication infrastructure with the intensity of someone who knew that systems failed when you needed them most. She had identified 17 potential vulnerabilities in their network, developed workarounds for 12 different scenarios of communication breakdown, and even taught herself rudimentary Russian to better monitor intercepted transmissions. None of this was in her job description, but Della had stopped caring about job descriptions the day she realized that following protocol exactly as written had killed better soldiers than her. Captain Henrik Larsen, the base's intelligence officer and Della's immediate superior, viewed her extensive preparation with suspicion rather than admiration. To him, she represented everything he found unsettling about modern warfare. Soldiers who had been damaged by combat, who brought emotional baggage and psychological complications to what should be clean, professional military operations. He preferred his intelligence work neat and predictable, conducted by personnel who hadn't been compromised by actual combat experience. The irony was lost on Larsen that his dismissal of Della's combat experience was exactly what made her invaluable. While he had spent his career in staff positions and training exercises, she had learned her skills in the crucible of actual warfare. Her trembling hands had once held together communication networks while under direct fire. Her hypervigilance, which he mistook for anxiety, was actually a finely tuned early warning system that had kept her alive when others had died. As the morning briefing concluded and personnel filed out to their assigned duties, Della remained in her seat, reviewing her notes one final time. She had developed a habit of staying after briefings to organize her thoughts, but also because she had learned to avoid the informal conversations that happened in hallways and break rooms. Her colleagues weren't cruel, but they weren't comfortable with her either. She was the soldier who had seen too much, done too much, survived too much to fit neatly into their peacetime routine. Captain Larsen's voice carried across the communications center with the authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the military hierarchy. At 38, he was everything the NATO bureaucracy valued. Educated at prestigious military academies, experienced in staff operations, and capable of reducing complex geopolitical situations to neat PowerPoint presentations. His blonde hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform bore creases sharp enough to cut glass, and his pale blue eyes held the confidence of a man whose biggest challenges had been logistical rather than lethal. Captain Larsen called out as Della hunched over her monitoring station, analyzing intercepted Russian communications. "I need those frequency reports on my desk by 1400 hours, and this time try to keep your analysis focused on what we actually need to know, not every theoretical scenario you can imagine." Della looked up from her work, careful to keep her expression neutral. "Sir, I've identified some irregular patterns in their communication protocols that might indicate you're overthinking again," Larsen interrupted with a dismissive wave. "We need intelligence reports, not fiction novels. Stick to the facts, Mitchell. Leave the strategic analysis to people qualified to do it." The sting of his words was familiar, but it never got easier. Della had written intelligence reports that had saved lives in Syria, had identified enemy movement patterns that had prevented ambushes, had predicted supply route vulnerabilities that had allowed her unit to capture critical resources. But at Base Aurora, her insights were treated as the overactive imagination of someone who had been traumatized by combat. Lieutenant Sophia Anderson, the base's logistics officer, glanced up from her own workstation with an expression of practiced sympathy. She was one of the few personnel who showed Della any kindness, though it was the careful compassion reserved for damaged things rather than genuine respect. "Don't let him get to you," she whispered, once Larsen had moved on. "He's just not used to working with people who've seen real action." But that was exactly the problem. Base Aurora was staffed primarily with NATO personnel who had built their careers in peacetime assignments, training exercises, and diplomatic missions. They were competent professionals who understood military doctrine and international relations, but few had experienced the chaos of actual combat. To them, Della represented something unsettling. Proof that war was messier, more unpredictable, and more psychologically demanding than their textbooks suggested. Master Sergeant Klaus Weber, the senior enlisted man responsible for base security, exemplified this attitude during the weekly security briefing. Weber was a career soldier from Germany who had spent 23 years in the military without ever firing his weapon in anger. His approach to security was methodical and thorough, based on established procedures and proven protocols.
When Della suggested modifications to their perimeter monitoring based on tactics she had observed in Syria, Weber's response was swift and dismissive. "Specialist Mitchell," he said, his English heavily accented but precise, "I understand that your previous experiences were difficult, but this is not Syria. We follow NATO's standard security procedures here, not improvised combat tactics from a war zone." The implied criticism was clear. Della's combat experience was a liability rather than an asset, something that made her unpredictable and unreliable rather than experienced and capable. Weber's security procedures were based on the assumption that threats would follow conventional patterns, that attackers would behave according to predictable doctrines, and that established protocols would be sufficient to handle any situation that arose. During coffee breaks in the mess hall, Della often overheard conversations that revealed how her colleagues truly viewed her. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos from Communications would lower her voice when discussing Della's technical reports. "She's incredibly thorough, I'll give her that, but sometimes I wonder if she's seeing threats that aren't really there. Combat stress can make people paranoid, you know?" Even the base's medical officer, Dr. James Crawford, had been briefed about Della's psychological profile. During her mandatory monthly check-ins, he would ask careful questions about her stress levels, her sleep patterns, and her emotional stability. His concern was genuine, but it was also limiting. He saw her hypervigilance as a symptom to be managed rather than a skill to be utilized, her detailed preparation as compulsive behavior rather than professional excellence. The most frustrating aspect of this environment was how her colleagues' dismissal became self-reinforcing. When Della identified potential security vulnerabilities, her warnings were attributed to combat-induced paranoia. When she suggested improvements to communication protocols, her ideas were dismissed as unnecessarily complicated solutions to problems that didn't exist. When she demonstrated technical skills that exceeded those of her peers, her competence was explained away as obsessive behavior rather than professional expertise. Captain Larsen embodied this attitude most completely. During staff meetings, he would introduce Della's reports with phrases like, "According to Specialist Mitchell's detailed analysis," or "Mitchell has some concerns about." The subtle emphasis he placed on certain words made it clear that her insights were to be taken with skepticism, that her combat experience was a source of bias rather than expertise. The cruel irony was that Captain Larsen's own lack of combat experience made him supremely confident in his analytical abilities. He had studied warfare from a theoretical perspective, understood military doctrine from an academic standpoint, and had developed strategies based on historical precedents and computer simulations. But he had never experienced the fog of war, never had to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information, never learned that the most dangerous threats often came from directions that doctrine said were impossible. This created an environment where Della's greatest strengths, her ability to think creatively under pressure, her understanding of how systems failed in real combat conditions, her hard-won knowledge of how enemies actually behaved rather than how they were supposed to behave, were systematically devalued and dismissed. She was fighting a war against perception as much as she had ever fought against actual enemies. Except this time, her opponents were her own colleagues, and their weapon was institutional bias rather than bullets.
The pattern of exclusion became most evident during Operation Baltic Shield, a joint NATO exercise designed to test the base's response to simulated Russian aggression. As personnel gathered in the main briefing room for mission assignments, Della sat in her usual back row position, her notebook ready to record whatever minor role she would be assigned, while others received the meaningful responsibilities. Captain Larsen stood at the podium, a digital map of the region displayed behind him showing potential conflict zones and strategic assets. The exercise would simulate a coordinated attack on NATO infrastructure, testing everything from communication networks to supply chain resilience. It was exactly the kind of scenario where Della's combat experience and technical expertise would prove invaluable. But she had learned not to expect recognition of her capabilities. "Lieutenant Anderson, you'll coordinate logistics and supply chain security," Larsen announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone distributing coveted assignments. "Sergeant Weber will handle base security and perimeter defense. Corporal Jensen takes point on electronic countermeasures." Each assignment was met with nods of acknowledgement and professional satisfaction. These were the roles that mattered, the positions that would be evaluated by senior command and could influence future career advancement. Della listened to each name called, each responsibility assigned, knowing that her own assignment would come last and carry the least significance. "Specialist Torres, you're our primary communications officer for the exercise," Larsen continued. Torres was competent enough, but Della knew that his experience was limited to peacetime operations and training scenarios. He had never maintained communications under actual combat stress, had never jerry-rigged equipment while under fire, had never learned to recognize the subtle indicators that suggested communication systems were about to fail catastrophically. The assignments continued, each one going to personnel whose qualifications looked impressive on paper, but who lacked the practical experience that Della possessed. Master Sergeant Kowalski would handle intelligence analysis, despite having never worked with combat intelligence in an active theater. Lieutenant Murphy would coordinate with simulated civilian authorities, though his only experience with crisis management came from classroom exercises. "Mitchell, you'll be in charge of equipment inventory and maintenance logs during the exercise. Make sure all communication gear is accounted for and properly documented." Equipment inventory. Again. Della nodded curtly, her jaw tight with frustration. Around her, the assigned personnel exchanged excited glances and began discussing coordination strategies. She might as well have been assigned to count paperclips while they planned for simulated warfare. After the briefing, Della overheard conversations that crystallized her colleagues' attitudes toward her capabilities. Lieutenant Murphy was speaking quietly with Corporal Jensen near the coffee station, their voices low, but not quite low enough to avoid her enhanced hearing, another combat-developed skill that her colleagues didn't know she possessed. "Good thing Mitchell's not on communications during the exercise," Murphy muttered, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary force. "I mean, I get that she's been through a lot, but we need someone stable handling the primary networks. Someone who won't freeze up if things get intense." Jensen nodded sagely, though his own combat experience consisted entirely of training exercises in peaceful conditions. "Exactly. She's got all that combat stress baggage, you know? Last thing we need during an exercise is someone having flashbacks or getting triggered by simulated explosions. Better to keep her on simple tasks where she can't cause problems." The casual dismissal of her combat experience as baggage rather than expertise burned in her chest. She had handled real communications under actual artillery fire, had maintained network stability while enemy forces overran positions, had improvised solutions to technical problems that would have paralyzed these peacetime soldiers. But her competence had been reframed as instability, her experience as psychological liability. During the exercise itself, Della watched from the equipment storage room as her colleagues struggled with scenarios that she could have handled effortlessly. When simulated electromagnetic interference disrupted their primary communication channels, Torres spent 20 precious minutes trying to implement textbook solutions that Della knew wouldn't work in real conditions. She had faced similar interference in Syria and had developed workarounds that could restore communications in minutes, but her role limited her to checking serial numbers on radio equipment. The most painful moment came when Lieutenant Anderson's logistics coordination broke down due to communication delays between different base sections. Della could see exactly what was happening. The standard NATO communication protocols weren't designed for the rapid tempo of crisis response, and the delay was creating cascading failures throughout their supply chain simulation. In Syria, she had learned to bypass standard protocols during emergencies, using priority channels and abbreviated reporting that maintained situational awareness without overwhelming the network.
She approached Lieutenant Anderson during a brief break, her voice respectful but urgent. "Ma'am, I've noticed that the communication delays are creating logistics bottlenecks. In my experience, there are ways to streamline the reporting protocols that could—" "Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but we need to follow established procedures during exercises. That's the whole point, to practice doing things the right way under pressure." The right way. Della bit back her response, understanding that Anderson's right way was theoretical, based on how systems were supposed to work, rather than how they actually functioned under stress. In combat, the right way was whatever kept people alive and missions successful, even if it deviated from doctrine.
While her colleagues socialized in the recreation room or caught up on sleep during their off-duty hours, Della Mitchell conducted her own private war college in the Communications Center after midnight. The base's security protocols allowed communications personnel access to equipment during non-standard hours for maintenance purposes, and Della had been quietly using this privilege to conduct extensive research and preparation that went far beyond her official duties. Her project began 3 months after arriving at Base Aurora, when she realized that the standard NATO communication systems had critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated adversaries. Drawing on her experience from Syria, where she had seen how quickly communication networks could be compromised or destroyed, Della began developing backup systems and alternative protocols that could maintain base operations even under the most adverse conditions. Working by the pale glow of computer monitors, she systematically mapped every communication pathway in and out of the base. Unlike the official network diagrams that showed ideal configurations, Della's hand-drawn charts included improvised connections, emergency bypasses, and unconventional routing options that could be implemented using equipment that wasn't officially designated for communication purposes. Her most ambitious project was creating what she privately called the Shadow Network, a backup communication system that could operate independently of the base's primary infrastructure. Using surplus equipment that was scheduled for disposal, spare parts from various sources, and connections that violated several technical regulations, Della had quietly assembled a communication network that could maintain basic operational capability even if the main systems were completely destroyed. The Shadow Network incorporated lessons learned from every communication failure she had witnessed in Syria. When enemy jamming had disabled their primary radios, she had learned to boost signals using metal debris as improvised reflectors. When mortar attacks had destroyed communication towers, she had discovered how to route signals through building infrastructure using techniques that no NATO manual described. When electronic warfare had disrupted their digital systems, she had developed analog fallback procedures that maintained basic command and control capability. But Della's preparation extended beyond technical systems to include intelligence analysis that rivaled the work of professional analysts. Each night, after completing her official duties, she spent hours monitoring Russian military communications, not just for the specific intelligence requirements in her job description, but to understand patterns and protocols that could provide strategic warning of hostile intentions. Her Russian language skills, developed through intensive self-study using online resources and intercepted communications, had progressed to the point where she could understand not just the literal content of enemy transmissions, but the subtle contextual clues that revealed operational intentions. She had identified 17 different Russian units operating in the Baltic region, mapped their communication networks, and developed profiles of individual commanders based on their tactical preferences and decision-making patterns. This intelligence work was entirely unauthorized and potentially career-ending if discovered by Captain Larsen. Military intelligence analysis was supposed to be conducted by trained specialists with appropriate security clearances and oversight, not by communications personnel working alone during off-duty hours. But Della had learned in Syria that understanding your enemy was the difference between life and death,
and she couldn't shake the feeling that Base Aurora's intelligence picture was incomplete and potentially dangerous. Her analysis had revealed troubling patterns in Russian military activity that weren't being captured in official intelligence reports. The communication intercepts that she was supposed to process for routine intelligence contained subtle indicators of increasing coordination between different Russian units, suggesting preparation for operations that were more complex than the standard border probes that NATO expected. Most concerning were the communication protocols that Russian forces had begun using during what appeared to be routine training exercises. Della recognized these protocols from Syria, where Russian-backed forces had used identical procedures immediately before launching coordinated attacks on Syrian government positions. The communication patterns suggested that Russian forces were rehearsing coordination procedures for multi-axis attacks that could overwhelm NATO's standard defensive responses. She had compiled this analysis into a detailed intelligence assessment that filled 3 notebooks with supporting evidence and tactical implications. But presenting this work to Captain Larsen would require admitting that she had exceeded her authority, violated regulations, and conducted unauthorized intelligence analysis using methods that weren't approved by NATO procedures. Her insights would be dismissed as the unauthorized work of someone who had overstepped her role, regardless of their accuracy or importance. Della's preparation also included physical conditioning that went beyond standard military fitness requirements. Her experience in Syria had taught her that combat survival often depended on endurance and strength that exceeded normal human limits. She had maintained the physical conditioning of a frontline soldier despite being assigned to a rear-area communications role, using the base gym during off-peak hours to maintain capabilities that her colleagues assumed she no longer possessed. Her training regimen was designed around the demands of combat communications work under extreme conditions. She could carry a fully loaded communications pack for extended distances without losing effectiveness, could set up complex antenna arrays under fire, and had developed the manual dexterity needed to repair sophisticated electronic equipment while wearing full protective gear. These skills were invisible to her colleagues, who saw only her small stature and assumed physical limitations, rather than recognizing carefully maintained combat capabilities.
The first signs of institutional suspicion emerged during a routine security inspection when Master Sergeant Weber discovered Della's after-hours access logs to the communications center. What began as a procedural review quickly evolved into something approaching an investigation, as her extensive off-duty activities attracted attention from personnel who had already questioned her commitment to her assigned role. Weber approached Captain Larsen with a printout of access records that showed Della had been in the communications center during non-standard hours on 47 separate occasions over the past 3 months. From Weber's perspective, this pattern suggested either security violations or inappropriate use of military equipment, both of which required immediate investigation. "Sir, I'm concerned about Specialist Mitchell's activities," Weber said, spreading the access logs across Larsen's desk like evidence in a criminal case. "She's been accessing the communications center at all hours, often staying until 0200 or 0300. That's far beyond what's required for routine maintenance or official duties." Larsen studied the logs with growing irritation. He had already been concerned about Della's excessive attention to details outside her assigned responsibilities, and these access logs suggested that her unauthorized initiative extended beyond work hours into potentially problematic territory. "What exactly is she doing in there?" "Unknown, sir. She claims it's equipment maintenance and system familiarization, but her activities seem far more extensive than necessary. I've also noticed that she's been accessing technical manuals and system documentation that aren't directly related to her assigned duties." This revelation confirmed Larsen's suspicions about Della's inappropriate ambitions. Military personnel were expected to focus on their assigned roles, not to conduct independent research into areas outside their expertise.
Her extensive preparation, which she viewed as professional development, was being reinterpreted as evidence of poor focus and potential insubordination. The investigation deepened when Lieutenant Anderson mentioned Della's detailed observations during the recent exercise. She had incredibly specific insights about logistics coordination and communication protocols, Anderson told Larsen during a private meeting, almost like she had been studying our procedures in detail and developing her own theories about how they could be improved. From Anderson's perspective, this level of detailed analysis was concerning because it suggested that Della was spending significant time analyzing aspects of base operations that weren't related to her communications duties. The fact that her insights were often correct only made the situation more troubling, as it implied systematic observation and analysis that exceeded her authorized role. Dr. Crawford, the base medical officer, added another layer of concern when he reported that Della's psychological profile suggested obsessive tendencies that might be affecting her professional judgment. She displays hypervigilance behavior that's consistent with combat stress reactions, he told Larsen confidentially. Her attention to detail and preparation for unlikely scenarios could indicate anxiety-driven compulsions rather than professional thoroughness. The medical assessment reframed Della's competence as a symptom of psychological instability. Her extensive preparation became evidence of obsessive behavior. Her combat-tested skills were redefined as stress-induced hypervigilance, and her professional insights were dismissed as the overactive imagination of someone struggling with war trauma. The situation escalated when Corporal Jensen discovered some of Della's handwritten notes during a routine equipment inspection. The notes, which detailed communication vulnerabilities and backup procedures, were written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be technical shorthand that Jensen couldn't fully understand. To someone unfamiliar with Della's background and capabilities, the notes looked like the work of someone who was conducting unauthorized research into base security procedures. "Sir, I found these in the Communications Center," Jensen reported, presenting Larsen with several pages of Della's technical analysis. They appear to be detailed diagrams of our communication networks, including notations about vulnerabilities and alternative routing procedures. Some of it is written in what might be foreign language abbreviations. Larsen examined the notes with growing alarm. The technical detail was impressive and concerning in equal measure, demonstrating knowledge of base systems that exceeded what a communication specialist should reasonably possess. The references to vulnerabilities and alternative procedures suggested that Della was thinking about scenarios that could compromise base security, which raised questions about her intentions and psychological state. The foreign language elements were particularly troubling to personnel who didn't know about Della's self-taught Russian language skills. To Larsen and his staff, the Cyrillic characters mixed with technical diagrams suggested possible security violations or inappropriate interest in enemy capabilities. The fact that the notes were technically accurate and strategically insightful only made them more concerning from a security perspective.
The meeting that would define Della's relationship with Base Aurora's command structure took place on a Thursday morning when Captain Larsen summoned her to his office with the formal tone reserved for disciplinary discussions. Della entered the room to find not only Larsen behind his desk, but also Master Sergeant Weber standing at attention near the window, and Dr. Crawford sitting in a chair that had been positioned to create an intimidating semicircle around the single seat clearly intended for her. "Specialist Mitchell, please take a seat," Larsen said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. The folder on his desk was thick with documentation, access logs, incident reports, and what appeared to be psychological evaluations that had been compiled without her knowledge. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your activities and focus." Della sat carefully, her posture erect and professional despite the anxiety building in her chest. She recognized the setup as a formal counseling session that could easily escalate to disciplinary action, and she understood her career at Base Aurora hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Yes, sir. Over the past several months, we've observed patterns of behavior that suggest you may be struggling to adapt to your current assignment," Larsen began. opening the folder and consulting documents that Della couldn't see clearly from her position. Your activities have raised questions about your focus, your understanding of appropriate boundaries, and your psychological readiness for the responsibilities we've assigned to you. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the fundamental accusation that Della was a problem soldier whose combat experience had made her unsuitable for peacetime military service. Weber shifted slightly, his expression stern but not unsympathetic, while Dr. Crawford took notes on a pad that suggested this conversation would become part of her permanent medical record. "Specialist Mitchell, please take a seat," Larsen said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your activities and focus." Della sat carefully, her posture erect and professional despite the anxiety building in her chest. She recognized the setup as a formal counseling session that could easily escalate to disciplinary action, and she understood her career at Base Aurora hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Yes, sir. Over the past several months, we've observed patterns of behavior that suggest you may be struggling to adapt to your current assignment," Larsen began, opening the folder and consulting documents that Della couldn't see clearly from her position. "Your activities have raised questions about your focus, your understanding of appropriate boundaries, and your psychological readiness for the responsibilities we've assigned to you." The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the fundamental accusation that Della was a problem soldier whose combat experience had made her unsuitable for peacetime military service. Weber shifted slightly, his expression stern but not unsympathetic, while Dr. Crawford took notes on a pad that suggested this conversation would become part of her permanent medical record. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand the specific concerns," Della replied, keeping her voice steady despite the growing realization that months of preparation and professional development were being reframed as evidence of instability. "My performance evaluations have been consistently satisfactory, and I've completed all assigned duties to standard." "That's exactly the problem, Mitchell," Larsen said, his tone sharpening. "Your duties are completed to standard, but your activities extend far beyond your duties. You've been accessing the Communications Center during unauthorized hours, conducting analysis of systems outside your area of responsibility, and asking questions about operational procedures that exceed your need-to-know clearance." Weber stepped forward, his voice adding the weight of senior enlisted authority to the confrontation. "Specialist, we've documented 47 instances of after-hours access to sensitive equipment, plus extensive notes about base vulnerabilities and alternative operational procedures. That level of interest in matters outside your assigned role raises security concerns." The word interest was delivered with subtle emphasis that made it clear Weber viewed her professional development as inappropriate curiosity rather than commendable initiative. Della felt the familiar burn of frustration as her competence was reframed as suspicious behavior, her preparation dismissed as obsessive overreach. "Gentlemen, if I may," Dr. Crawford interjected, consulting his notes with the careful precision of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Specialist Mitchell's behavior patterns are consistent with combat stress reactions that haven't been fully resolved. The hypervigilance, the obsessive preparation for unlikely scenarios, the difficulty accepting limitations on her role, these are classic symptoms of someone who hasn't successfully transitioned from combat operations to peacetime military service." The psychological assessment hit like a physical blow. Della's combat-tested skills were being pathologized, her professional competence reframed as mental health symptoms that required management rather than utilization. She understood that arguing with the medical assessment would only reinforce their perception that she lacked insight into her own condition. "Sir, with respect," Della said carefully, "my preparation and system analysis are based on professional experience and training. In Syria, I learned that communication systems fail in predictable ways, and that having backup procedures and alternative capabilities can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But this isn't Syria. This is a NATO intel post in a stable allied nation. The scenarios you're preparing for don't exist here, and your inability to recognize that suggests you're not mentally present in your current assignment."
The attack began at 03:47 hours on what had started as an unremarkably quiet Tuesday morning, when Della Mitchell was jolted awake not by her alarm clock, but by the deep, rhythmic throbbing of helicopter rotors that sounded wrong, too low, too fast, and coming from the wrong direction. Her combat-trained instincts recognized the sound immediately, military aircraft operating in tactical formation, approaching the base from the northeast, where no friendly flights were scheduled. She rolled out of her bunk and moved to the small window of her quarters, peering through the pre-dawn darkness toward the sound of the approaching aircraft. What she saw made her blood freeze. 6 helicopters in tight formation, their navigation lights dark, flying at dangerously low altitude toward Base Aurora's perimeter. The aircraft were maintaining radio silence and approaching from the exact direction that she had identified months ago as the most vulnerable axis of attack. The first explosions came 30 seconds later, as precision-guided missiles struck the base's primary communication towers and power generation facility with devastating accuracy. The blasts shattered windows throughout the base and sent tremors through the ground that knocked Della to her knees as emergency lighting flickered on throughout the compound. Within minutes, the base's primary communication systems were completely destroyed, leaving 847 NATO personnel isolated from higher command and unable to coordinate response to an attack that was clearly planned and executed with detailed knowledge of their defensive capabilities. The enemy had struck first at their ability to call for help, then at their capacity to coordinate internal defense. Della grabbed her pre-packed emergency kit, gear that her colleagues had mocked as paranoid over-preparation, and ran toward the communications center through corridors filled with confused personnel trying to understand what was happening. The base's emergency alert system was functioning, but without external communications, no one could determine whether this was an isolated attack or part of a larger offensive operation. In the communications center, chaos reigned, as technicians frantically tried to restore contact with NATO headquarters using backup systems that had been damaged by the precision strikes. Captain Larsen stood in the center of the room, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he realized that their standard emergency procedures were completely inadequate for their current situation. "Torres, what's our communication status?" Larsen demanded, his voice tight with stress as explosions continued to rock the base perimeter. "Sir, primary towers are destroyed, backup antennas are down, and we're getting no response on any frequency," Torres replied, his hands shaking as he worked through emergency restoration procedures that weren't designed for this level of system damage. "We're completely cut off from higher command." Master Sergeant Weber burst into the communications center, his uniform torn and his face blackened from smoke from the burning power facility. "Sir, we're under coordinated attack by what appears to be Russian special forces. They've knocked out our primary defenses and are advancing on multiple axes. Without communication capability, we can't coordinate our defensive response or call for reinforcement." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Della realized that everything she had prepared for during months of unauthorized analysis was now happening exactly as she had predicted. The enemy was using the communication vulnerabilities she had identified, approaching from the directions she had mapped as most dangerous, and employing tactics that she recognized from her Syria experience. Lieutenant Anderson ran into the communications center, her logistics coordination completely disrupted by the loss of internal communication networks. "Sir, I can't maintain contact with defensive positions around the perimeter. Our standard radio procedures aren't working because of some kind of electronic interference, and I don't know how to adapt our coordination procedures." Dr. Crawford followed shortly after, his medical training utterly inadequate for treating combat casualties using improvised equipment in a facility where normal supply procedures had been disrupted by the attack. "Captain, I'm getting reports of multiple casualties, but I can't coordinate emergency medical evacuation because we've lost contact with our emergency response teams." As the situation reports accumulated, Della watched her colleagues struggle with problems that she had spent months analyzing and developing solutions for. The shadow network she had constructed could restore basic communication capability. Her intelligence analysis had identified the exact tactics the enemy was now using, and her contingency procedures could coordinate defensive response even without standard NATO communication protocols. But she was bound by the direct orders that Captain Larsen had given her just weeks earlier. Limit herself to assigned duties, avoid analyzing systems outside her responsibility, and accept the professional boundaries of her current role. Speaking up now would be direct insubordination that could result in court-martial, even if her insights could save lives.
The decision point came when a runner arrived from the perimeter with news that shattered any hope of conventional response. "Sir, the enemy has established positions that completely surround the base. They're using advanced electronic warfare capabilities that are jamming our standard communication frequencies, and they appear to have detailed knowledge of our defensive positions and response procedures."
Captain Larsen stared at Della with a mixture of desperation and skepticism that perfectly captured the fundamental conflict between his institutional biases and the reality of their tactical situation. Even with explosions continuing to rock the base and communication systems completely down, his first instinct was to question whether someone with her psychological profile could handle the responsibility he was considering giving her. "Mitchell, what exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who needed her help but still doubted her capabilities. "And why should we trust solutions that violate established procedures during a crisis situation?" Della could see the doubt in his eyes, the same skepticism that had relegated her to equipment inventories while others handled important responsibilities. But she also understood that desperate situations demanded clear explanations rather than defensive reactions. "Sir, the enemy is using sophisticated electronic warfare that's designed to defeat standard NATO communication protocols, but they're jamming frequencies and disrupting systems that they expect us to use. My backup network operates on different frequencies and uses routing procedures that wouldn't appear in their intelligence about our capabilities." Lieutenant Anderson stepped forward, her logistics coordination completely paralyzed by the communication breakdown. "What kind of backup network? And why wasn't this included in our standard emergency procedures if it's so effective?" The question revealed the institutional thinking that had kept Della marginalized. If her solutions weren't part of official procedures, they must be unreliable or inappropriate for military use. Her months of unauthorized preparation were still being viewed with suspicion, even as conventional approaches failed completely. "Ma'am, I developed the backup network using surplus equipment and alternative routing procedures based on lessons learned in Syria. It wasn't included in standard procedures because I wasn't authorized to propose modifications to official protocols." Master Sergeant Weber, his security procedures already overwhelmed by an enemy that had anticipated their defensive response, voiced the concern that several others were clearly thinking. "Specialist, you're talking about using improvised equipment and unauthorized procedures during a combat situation. That's exactly the kind of non-standard approach that creates more problems than it solves." The irony was overwhelming. Weber's standard security procedures had been completely anticipated and neutralized by the enemy, but he was still skeptical of alternatives that fell outside official doctrine. Della realized that her colleagues' institutional bias against unauthorized innovation was so deep that they would rather fail using approved methods than succeed using unconventional approaches. Dr. Crawford, struggling to coordinate medical response without functional communication networks, added his own layer of institutional resistance. "Specialist Mitchell, your psychological profile suggests that high-stress situations might trigger combat stress reactions that could impair your judgment. Are you certain you're mentally prepared to handle the responsibility of restoring critical communication systems?" Even as enemy forces tightened their grip around the base, Dr. Crawford was still viewing Della's combat experience as a liability rather than an asset. The same psychological resilience that had kept her alive in Syria was being questioned as a potential weakness that might cause her to fail when her colleagues needed her most. Torres, whose standard communication procedures had failed completely, raised another concern that revealed the depth of institutional bias against unconventional approaches. "Sir, if we let Mitchell implement unauthorized procedures and something goes wrong, we could lose what little communication capability we have left. Shouldn't we stick with approved methods even if they're not working perfectly?" The question perfectly encapsulated the military mindset that prioritized following procedures over achieving results. Torres would rather fail using approved methods than risk success using techniques that hadn't been officially sanctioned, even when those approved methods had already proven completely inadequate. Captain Larsen looked around the room at his staff, all of whom were struggling with problems that exceeded their peacetime training and experience. The enemy's attack had been precisely calibrated to exploit the weaknesses of standard NATO procedures, and his personnel were psychologically unprepared to abandon doctrine even when doctrine was failing.
Mitchell, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command authority and personal desperation. Even if your backup systems can restore some communication capability, how do we coordinate defense against an enemy that clearly has detailed intelligence about our standard response procedures? Our doctrine assumes that we can communicate with higher command and coordinate with allied forces. This was the question that revealed the true scope of their tactical problem. Restoring communication capability would be meaningless if they continued to use predictable response procedures that the enemy had already anticipated and countered. They needed not just alternative technology, but alternative tactical thinking that could outmaneuver an opponent who had planned for their conventional responses.
Captain Larsen's authorization came in the form of a simple nod, not the formal orders that would protect Della from court-martial if her unauthorized methods failed, but desperate permission from a commanding officer who had run out of conventional options. "Do it, Mitchell. Do whatever you think will work." Della moved immediately, her combat-trained instincts taking complete control as she transitioned from dismissed specialist to operational leader in the span of seconds. The tremor that had plagued her hands since Syria disappeared completely, replaced by the steady precision of someone who had maintained communication networks under enemy fire and knew exactly what needed to be done. "Torres, I need you to gather every piece of electronic equipment you can find, radios, phones, computer modems, anything that can generate or receive signals," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that none of her colleagues had heard before. "Anderson, we need metal objects for antenna construction, fence posts, maintenance ladders, even kitchen equipment if it's metallic." The transformation was startling to personnel who had only seen Della in her diminished role as equipment inventory specialist. Now she moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had coordinated complex technical operations under extreme pressure, issuing precise instructions based on deep technical knowledge and hard-won practical experience. Weber started to object to the improvised approach, but Della cut him off with information that demonstrated the scope of her unauthorized intelligence analysis. "Sergeant, the enemy is using electronic warfare tactics that I recognize from Syrian operations. They're jamming our primary frequencies, but they're not prepared for the backup frequencies and routing procedures I've developed." She led the team toward the equipment storage area, moving with purpose through corridors where explosions continued to echo and emergency lighting cast stark shadows on walls. Behind her, personnel who had dismissed her preparation as obsessive behavior began to understand that her months of unauthorized work had been methodical preparation for exactly this scenario. In the storage area, Della revealed the extent of her hidden preparation by quickly assembling communication equipment that she had pre-positioned months earlier. The shadow network that she had built during after-hours access sessions became operational within minutes, using routing procedures that bypassed the systems the enemy had targeted for destruction. "Sir, I'm getting signal through alternative channels," she announced to Captain Larsen, who had followed the group to witness her improvised communication restoration. "I can establish contact with NATO headquarters, but we need to use authentication procedures that aren't in our standard manual because the enemy may have compromised our normal codes." The breakthrough was simultaneously vindicating and terrifying for Larsen. Della's unauthorized preparation was proving effective, but she was also revealing that their standard security procedures were potentially compromised, forcing them to rely on methods that fell completely outside established doctrine. As communication capability was restored, Della simultaneously implemented the tactical analysis she had conducted during months of unauthorized intelligence gathering. "Captain, the attack patterns suggest Russian special forces using the same coordination techniques I observed in Syria. They're jamming our primary frequencies, but they're not prepared for the backup frequencies and routing procedures I've developed." Master Sergeant Weber, his conventional security procedures having failed completely, found himself taking tactical guidance from someone whose expertise he had previously dismissed. "Mitchell, what specific positioning changes are you recommending, and how do you know the enemy isn't prepared for those alternatives?" Della's answer revealed the depth of her intelligence analysis and strategic thinking. "Sergeant, their attack axes and timing suggest they've studied our standard defensive responses extensively, but they've positioned their forces to counter NATO doctrine responses, not improvised defensive strategies based on terrain advantages they probably haven't analyzed." Working with rapid efficiency that amazed her colleagues, Della coordinated defensive repositioning using communication networks that operated outside the enemy's jamming capabilities. Her instructions drew on tactical knowledge gained in Syria, where she had learned to coordinate defensive responses using improvised communication methods and unconventional positioning strategies.
Lieutenant Anderson watched in amazement as Della simultaneously restored communication capability and coordinated logistics support using procedures that weren't in any manual. Mitchell, how did you know to prepare backup systems for this exact scenario? This level of preparation would require months of work and detailed intelligence analysis. Ma'am, I spent 8 months analyzing our vulnerabilities and developing contingency procedures for scenarios that seemed unlikely but possible, Della replied, her hands moving efficiently across improvised control panels that she had designed and built without authorization. My experience in Syria taught me that the most dangerous threats are usually the ones that peacetime planning doesn't consider. The tactical situation began to shift as Della's unconventional approaches proved effective against an enemy that had prepared extensively to defeat standard NATO responses. Her backup communication networks allowed coordination that the enemy hadn't anticipated, and her defensive recommendations exploited terrain advantages that weren't included in conventional doctrine.
Within 45 minutes of Della taking operational control, the tactical situation at Base Aurora had shifted from desperate defense to coordinated counterattack. Her shadow network not only maintained communication with NATO headquarters, but also established contact with Estonian military forces who had been monitoring the attack and were prepared to provide support using coordination procedures that Della had studied but never been authorized to implement. Nighthawk 6, this is Aurora Base, Della transmitted using authentication codes she had memorized from her unauthorized intelligence analysis. We have restored communication capability and are requesting immediate air support for enemy positions at grid coordinates November 7-4 Alpha Charlie. Enemy forces are using electronic warfare capabilities but are vulnerable to approaches from sectors they haven't anticipated. The response from NATO Command revealed the scope of the enemy operation and the critical importance of Base Aurora's continued resistance. Aurora Base, confirmed. You're the only installation in the Baltic region that has maintained operational capability. Enemy forces have launched coordinated attacks on 7 NATO facilities. Your continued operations are essential for regional command and control. Captain Larsen's face went pale as he realized that their small intelligence post had become the linchpin for NATO's entire regional response. Without Della's backup systems, they would have been isolated and overwhelmed like the other attacked installations, leaving NATO blind to enemy operations across the Baltic region. Sir, I'm coordinating with Estonian Rapid Response Forces who can provide ground support, Della reported, working efficiently with the communication equipment that she had modified using techniques learned in Syria. Their tactical doctrine is different from ours, but I can adapt our coordination procedures to integrate their capabilities with our defensive positions. Master Sergeant Weber, whose conventional security procedures had been completely overwhelmed by the initial attack, watched in amazement as Della coordinated defensive responses that utilized capabilities he hadn't known existed. Sergeant, how are you coordinating with Estonian forces using procedures we've never practiced? Sergeant, I studied Estonian military doctrine during my off-duty hours and developed integration procedures as part of my unauthorized contingency planning. Our NATO doctrine includes provisions for Allied coordination, but doesn't specify practical implementation procedures for this operational environment. The effectiveness of her preparation became evident as Estonian forces arrived at positions that Della had identified as optimal for supporting base defense. Her tactical analyses had anticipated exactly this scenario, and her coordination procedures enabled seamless integration of Allied forces with base personnel who had no training in joint operations. Lieutenant Anderson, coordinating logistics using Della's improvised systems, made a discovery that revealed another dimension of her unauthorized preparation. Captain, Mitchell has detailed maps of local supply caches and alternative transportation routes that aren't in any of our official materials. She's been analyzing local infrastructure for months. Dr. Crawford, directing medical evacuation using alternative communication procedures that Della had developed, added his own amazement at the scope of her preparation. Sir, her medical coordination protocols are more sophisticated than what we were trained to use, and they're specifically adapted for conditions where standard evacuation procedures aren't available. As air support arrived and enemy positions came under coordinated attack, the tide of battle shifted decisively in favor of the defenders. Della's tactical predictions proved accurate with precision that demonstrated not just technical competence, but strategic understanding that exceeded what anyone had expected from a communications specialist. Aurora Base, this is Thunderbolt 1.
came the voice of the air support commander through Della's communication network. Your target designation and tactical coordination are outstanding. Enemy forces are withdrawing under pressure, and their electronic warfare capabilities are being neutralized. Captain Larsen watched the tactical display as enemy forces, who had planned their attack around NATO standard responses, found themselves outmaneuvered by defensive strategies they hadn't anticipated. Della's unconventional approaches had disrupted their operational planning and exposed them to counterattacks that their intelligence hadn't predicted. Torres, whose standard communication procedures had failed completely at the beginning of the attack, approached Della with an expression of professional respect that had been completely absent during their previous interactions. "Mitchell, your backup systems are not just working, they're working better than our primary systems ever did. How did you develop capabilities that exceed official NATO standards?" "Torres, I spent 8 months analyzing every communication failure I witnessed in Syria and developing procedures to prevent those failures from recurring. My experience taught me that backup systems need to be fundamentally different from primary systems, not just redundant copies." As enemy forces completed their withdrawal and the immediate tactical crisis ended, Della maintained coordination with Allied forces and NATO command to ensure that regional security was fully restored. Her unauthorized intelligence network had provided strategic warning that enabled rapid response to the broader enemy operation. "All stations, this is NATO Regional Command," came the transmission through Della's communication network. "Aurora Base has successfully repelled coordinated enemy attack and maintained regional communication capability. Outstanding performance by all personnel involved in defensive operations." The commendation was gratifying, but Della understood that the real measure of success was the fact that every person at Base Aurora had survived an attack that was designed to overwhelm their capabilities. Her months of unauthorized preparation, dismissed as inappropriate overreach, had proven to be exactly what was needed to save lives and maintain operational capability.
The after-action review convened at 1400 hours in the main briefing room where just 24 hours earlier, Captain Larsen had been assigning routine duties to personnel he considered appropriately matched to their capabilities. Now the same room hosted a formal inquiry led by Colonel Marcus Reynolds from NATO Regional Command, who had flown in specifically to understand how Base Aurora had not only survived, but maintained operational effectiveness during an attack that had overwhelmed 6 other installations. Della sat in the front row, her uniform still bearing traces of the improvised equipment modifications she had implemented during the crisis. Around her, the same colleagues who had dismissed her preparation as obsessive behavior now waited to provide testimony about capabilities they hadn't known existed until those capabilities had saved their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Reynolds began, consulting a thick folder of preliminary reports. "Yesterday's attack was the most sophisticated assault on NATO infrastructure in the Baltic region since the alliance was established. Enemy forces demonstrated detailed intelligence about our standard procedures, advanced electronic warfare capabilities, and coordination techniques that successfully neutralized 6 of 7 targeted installations." The scope of the enemy operation was sobering. Base Aurora hadn't been an isolated target, but part of a coordinated attack designed to blind NATO's regional intelligence capability and disrupt command and control networks throughout the Baltic theater. Their survival had prevented a strategic success that could have compromised Allied defensive capabilities across multiple nations. However, Reynolds continued, his attention focusing directly on Della, this installation not only survived, but maintained full operational capability throughout the attack, and served as the coordination point for regional counter-operations. I'm here to understand how Specialist Mitchell's response differed so significantly from standard NATO procedures. Captain Larsen shifted uncomfortably in his seat, understanding that the inquiry would necessarily examine his command decisions and personnel management. The success of Della's unauthorized preparations reflected poorly on his leadership and raised questions about how other installations had failed to develop similar capabilities. "Sir, Specialist Mitchell had developed backup communication systems and tactical procedures that weren't part of our standard operational plans," Larsen admitted.
his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility and personal recognition of his errors in judgment. Her preparations were extensive and sophisticated beyond what I had understood. Reynolds consulted his notes, which clearly included detailed technical analysis of Della's improvised systems. Specialist Mitchell, your backup communication network utilized frequency ranges and routing procedures that aren't included in standard NATO technical manuals. How did you develop capabilities that exceeded official specifications? Della understood that her answer would be evaluated not just for its technical content, but for its implications about military training, doctrine, and personnel management. She had proven that individual initiative could exceed institutional capabilities, but she had also demonstrated that official procedures had dangerous limitations. Sir, my experience in Syria revealed vulnerabilities in standard communication systems when subjected to sophisticated electronic warfare, she replied, keeping her voice professional despite the magnitude of what she was describing. I developed alternate capabilities based on lessons learned from system failures that I had personally witnessed and analyzed. Master Sergeant Weber, whose security procedures had been completely inadequate for the actual threat, provided testimony that revealed the scope of his earlier misconceptions. Sir, I initially viewed Specialist Mitchell's extensive preparation as inappropriate focus on scenarios outside her assigned responsibilities. I now understand that her analysis was more accurate and comprehensive than our official threat assessments. The admission was professionally damaging for Weber, but it also highlighted a systemic problem. NATO's institutional training had not prepared personnel for threats that exceeded doctrinal assumptions. Della's unauthorized analysis had identified vulnerabilities that official intelligence had missed or dismissed as unlikely. Dr. Crawford's testimony addressed the psychological assessment that had originally been used to limit Della's responsibilities. Colonel, my initial evaluation interpreted Della's hypervigilance and detailed preparation as symptoms of combat stress that required management. Her performance during the crisis demonstrates that these behaviors were actually professional competencies that enabled exceptional crisis response. The medical reassessment was a complete reversal of the psychological profile that had been used to justify keeping Della in a limited role. Her combat experience, rather than being a liability that required careful handling, was the foundation for capabilities that had proven essential for mission success. Lieutenant Anderson's logistics testimony revealed another dimension of Della's unauthorized preparation. Sir, Della had developed detailed analysis of local infrastructure, supply chains, and coordination procedures with Allied forces. Her knowledge exceeded what any of our official personnel possessed about the operational environment. Torres added technical testimony that highlighted the superior quality of Della's improvised systems. Colonel, her backup communication network wasn't just functional, it was more reliable and flexible than our primary systems. Her technical modifications demonstrated engineering capabilities that exceeded standard training levels.
6 months after the attack that had transformed her from dismissed specialist to regional tactical innovator, Staff Sergeant Della Mitchell stood in the same briefing room at Base Aurora, but everything had changed. The room now served as the headquarters for NATO's Advanced Tactical Analysis Division, a program she had developed that integrated combat-experienced personnel with institutional planning to create capabilities that exceeded traditional doctrinal limitations. The morning briefing she now conducted attracted personnel from throughout the Baltic region who came to study methods that had proven superior to conventional approaches. Her audience included officers whose theoretical training had been augmented by practical insights that could only come from personnel who had survived actual combat and learned lessons that no classroom could provide. Today, we're analyzing communication vulnerabilities in forward operating bases that were identified by Sergeant Torres, who applied analytical methods we've developed to his home installation in Lithuania, Della announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose methods had been validated by successful crisis response. His analysis identified 17 potential points of failure that weren't addressed by standard NATO security protocols. Torres, whose initial skepticism about Della's unauthorized methods had been completely transformed by their demonstrated effectiveness, presented findings that exemplified the program's success in developing exceptional capabilities among personnel who had previously been limited to routine duties. The transformation extended beyond individual personnel to encompass fundamental changes in how NATO approached strategic planning and threat analysis throughout the region. Rather than relying exclusively on theoretical models and doctrinal assumptions, the new approach integrated practical experience from personnel who had faced actual combat conditions and learned lessons that couldn't be captured in conventional training. Captain Larsen, whose initial dismissal of Della's capabilities had nearly prevented the development of life-saving innovations, now served as administrative support for programs that he had come to understand exceeded his own theoretical knowledge. His role had evolved from supervising her activities to facilitating her development of capabilities that influence policy at the highest levels of NATO command. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, he said during a brief break in the briefing, "The regional commander has requested a briefing on your analysis of electronic warfare vulnerabilities in Baltic installations. Your insights are being incorporated into alliance-wide defensive planning." The request represented recognition at the highest levels of NATO command that Della's methods had strategic value that extended throughout the NATO alliance. Her individual innovation, initially dismissed as inappropriate overreach, had become the foundation for institutional capabilities that enhanced security for thousands of personnel across multiple nations. Master Sergeant Weber, whose conventional security procedures had been completely inadequate for sophisticated threats, had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new analytical methods. Mitchell, your vulnerability analysis program has identified security gaps at installations throughout the region that our standard assessments had missed. We've prevented potential attacks by implementing countermeasures based on your methods. Dr. Crawford's medical assessment provided psychological validation for the broader program that had emerged from Della's individual success. The personnel who have participated in Mitchell's advanced training program show enhanced professional confidence and improved crisis response capabilities. Combat experience, when properly integrated with institutional knowledge, creates competencies that exceed what either approach achieves independently. Lieutenant Anderson, whose logistics coordination had been transformed by Della's alternate procedures, had developed new capabilities that influence supply chain management throughout the region. Della, the contingency planning methods you developed have been adopted by logistics commands across 3 NATO countries. Your approach to infrastructure analysis has prevented supply chain failures that could have compromised multiple operations. The ripple effects of institutional change extended beyond Base Aurora to influence how NATO identified and developed exceptional capabilities among personnel whose potential had been limited by conventional role assignments. Della's success had demonstrated that individual initiative, when properly supported and utilized, could exceed collective institutional planning. As the briefing concluded, Della reflected on the journey from dismissed communications specialist to regional tactical innovator. The tremor in her hands had completely disappeared, not because her combat experiences had been forgotten, but because those experiences had been recognized as professional assets that enhanced rather than limited her capabilities. The scars that Captain Larsen had once ridiculed as evidence of psychological dysfunction had become the foundation for innovations that saved lives and enhanced security for thousands of NATO personnel. Her hypervigilance, initially viewed as problematic anxiety, had been revealed as tactical awareness that enabled threat detection and crisis response that exceeded standard institutional capabilities. Staff Sergeant, you have a video conference with Brussels Command in 30 minutes. They want your assessment of advanced tactical analysis implementation throughout the European theater. The request represented recognition at the highest levels of NATO command that Della's methods had strategic value that could enhance alliance-wide security capabilities. Her individual innovation, initially dismissed as inappropriate overreach, had become the institutional transformation that would influence military operations for years to come. As she prepared for another day of developing capabilities that would protect thousands of NATO personnel, Della understood that her greatest achievement had been proving that limitations were often imposed by others' expectations rather than actual inability. Her tremor in her hands had completely disappeared, not because her combat experiences had been forgotten, but because those experiences had been recognized as professional assets that enhanced rather than limited her capabilities. The scars that Captain Larsen had once ridiculed as evidence of psychological dysfunction had become the foundation for innovations that saved lives and enhanced security for thousands of NATO personnel. Her hypervigilance, initially viewed as problematic anxiety, had been revealed as tactical awareness that enabled threat detection and crisis response that exceeded standard institutional capabilities. The woman they had called damaged goods had become the soldier who rewrote the rules of modern military operations, one unauthorized innovation at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.